Generally, when we talk about a video game innovating in some way, it's taking the existing mechanics and maybe adding one or two new things. The ability to look up and down in video games was seen as pretty amazing when it first hit with, I believe it was Quake 2. The ability to observe and rotate objects in Half-Life was literally what made Valve the mega titan it is today. Generally, innovation is seen as a purely mechanical thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Sometimes innovation can happen on a more emotional level. Sometimes just taking the same set of mechanics and changing its sort of vibe can really change up how you look at a style of video game. Sometimes even allowing you to look at an entire genre completely differently. Final Fantasy as a series innovated on the classic RPG struggle, and it didn't even change up the story a whole lot. It was still a team of heroes going against the big bad guy trying to destroy the world, but it added this more grandiose vibe. What with you specifically being the warriors of light and hunting down the crystals to bring back stability. It wasn't any specific thing, but the overall package that really led to the games feeling unique and spawning a series that would continue on through this day to be one of the best known RPG series in the world. There's a genre of game generally known for its strategic thinking and sort of calculated nature, this being the deck builder. Deck building games generally ask the player to stop and consider everything they're doing very slowly. They're very minimal on graphics and sound to allow the player maximum focus when it comes to how they act in-game in order to best facilitate the player's ability to, win in combat. However, recently, a game has come out that I think really takes the formula of the deck builder and kind of turns it on its head, making it less about the specific deck building aspect and more about the vibe and the style. This game being Fights in Tight Spaces. Fights in Tight Spaces is a game with a very loose story where you play a mercenary or hitman kind of character in a series of elaborate scenes where you have to, fight a bunch of enemies in tight spaces. Just like in any other deck builder game, you have a set amount of energy and card draw every turn, and each card played damages enemies, gives you energy, allows you to draw more cards, or something to that effect. One of the fairly unique portions of Fights in Tight Spaces is that the fights take place on a grid, which incorporates actual movement into the game, and this is one of the first major innovations that the game adds. Most deck builder games that I've played, such as Eratus and Slay the Spire, have the characters held in a static position, but Fights in Tight Spaces is a highly kinetic game. This is a game that wants every piece on the board to be moving near constantly. There's a number of ability cards purely dedicated to getting pieces to move, as well as moving your character. The ability to pivot, to turn the enemy in certain directions, to move enemies, these are all considered major, integral parts of your character's abilities in the game, as positioning really does dominate. But what does this have to do with the vibe? These sound purely like mechanics. Well, it's hard to explain the experience of playing Fights in Tight Spaces, as there aren't many games that capture a similar vibe. I can really only think of one, and that is Superhot. Superhot, for those who are unfamiliar, is an action game where you have to fight multiple enemies using your environment. Generally, I've only played the game in VR, but the idea is you have to look around, find weapons, and use them to fight off a bunch of red, blocky enemies. It has a special feature that makes it so that time only moves when you move. It leads to this very frantic but well planned out combat sequence where you duck to the left as a bullet comes whizzing past your head to grab a gun so you can shoot the guy who happens to be in the direction that that gun is from you. You drop the gun, pick up a bottle, throw it at the guy standing in front of you as you grab a knife with your other hand and stab the guy who just fired the bullet at you in the face. This reminds me very strongly of many action films. Of course, the most comparable action film to this would be films like John Wick or The Matrix. But how are these games similar at all? How are they able to capture the same vibe? One is a roguelike deck builder, and the other is a VR game where you're expected to be up and moving around a lot. Well, aside from the art style, which the games share in common, keeping a minimalistic background and stark colored characters, a lot of what makes Superhot and Fights in Tight Spaces feel similar are how it focuses on that sort of frantic feeling, where Superhot has its frantic feelings come from you being up and moving around. Fights in Tight Spaces happens to capture this through its soundscape and animation design. Whenever you play an attack or defense card in Fights in Tight Spaces, the characters will perform these very frantic movements. You'll end up pushing or pulling an enemy. You'll end up kicking hard enough to move yourself forward and the enemy backwards. Pushing an enemy into a wall or turning them slightly is a major part of how you end up getting tactical advantage in Fights in Tight Spaces. Both games are highly kinetic, taking advantage of continuous motion from action to action. In Superhot, you never want to waste any movement because, well, as you move, everything around you moves. Sure, you can look around and it's important that you do so, but if you do so with your head, that bullet is going to keep traveling towards you. You need to be quick to perceive the environment around you. And Fights in Tight Spaces feels very similar. Sure, you're not personally in that world. However, every card played adds to the momentum of the fight. If you allow your opponents to control the movement of the board, it puts you at a great disadvantage. Meanwhile, your personal positioning will always add to the advantage that you as a player have. Is there a wall? Well, kicking your opponent into it will deal the damage of the kick and also additional damage from colliding with an object, in particular the wall. Is there a blank space where a wall should be? That's an exit. If you kick an enemy out of an exit, you can kill them instantly without having to deal damage. This can be important for dealing with boss enemies, although boss enemies tend to be a bit more clever about their own positioning. Is someone about to fire a gun? Well, if I can shove, pivot, or in some other way reposition my opponent to be between me and the bullet, then I can get them to take the shot instead of me. Are you in a group of 4 guys? Well, you're likely about to get shoved in a circle between all of them, and that will make for a really bad time for you. The soundscape of Fights in Tight Spaces also contributes to its action movie feel. Every hit has a weighty thud to it. Every single motion has the sound of cloth shuffling against itself. And the music in this game is just amazing. Seriously, it's not very often that a game gets me this pumped for simply playing a handful of cards in a row. But this game does a really amazing feeling of you making you feel like an action star when really, like I said, all you're doing is playing cards. This is Superhot meets Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's a hell of a combination. I highly recommend Fights in Tight Spaces to anyone interested in feeling like that action hero, but doesn't particularly want to bother getting a Oculus Quest and getting up and going through all that physical exertion that's involved with Superhot. I think that the two games feel very similar, and I've spent a fair amount of time playing Superhot and the demo, at least, for Fights in Tight Spaces. But what do you guys think? I'd be interested in hearing what you guys think in the comments down below. Is there any other games that you guys can think of that mash up vibe and genre in such an interesting way? Let me know down below. And if you liked this video and are interested in seeing my thoughts on more games that are coming out, make sure to subscribe. In the meantime, y'all, though, just remember, nobody cares. Thank you very much and good night.